In the year 188 before the Common Era, with the ratification of the Treaty of Apamea, the Roman Republic secured its absolute hegemony over the Mediterranean Sea. One might reasonably ask, to what degree did this new Roman supremacy assert itself? To what extent did its power truly extend? A brief anecdote shall serve to illuminate the matter. The Seleucid dynasty, after the death of Antiochus III, passed first through the hands of Seleucus IV, and then to Antiochus IV. Both were men of considerable ability and, it must be said, ambition. Antiochus IV, having roundly defeated Egypt, harbored notions of annexing the entire territory for himself. Yet, just as he was preening in the glow of his victory, Rome dispatched an envoy, a man by the name of Linas. His message was brutally simple. Antiochus was to withdraw from all occupied lands and return whence he came. Had he so quickly forgotten the Treaty of Apamea? The Seleucid kingdom, he was reminded, was to confine its aspirations to its own domains. By what right did he swagger and boast on Egyptian soil? Antiochus IV initially put on a rather brave face. He declared that the matter required further deliberation. He would, he said, give the matter his full attention and furnish Rome with a reply in due course. The Roman envoy, Linas, remained quite unperturbed. With his staff, he calmly drew a circle in the sand around the feet of Antiochus IV, enclosing the king within it. He then said, with that same unnerving calm, "Before you step out of this circle, I expect to hear your reply to the Roman Senate and its people." At this, Antiochus was utterly dumbfounded. He stood there, a king, looking down at the simple, sandy circle that had become his prison. After a period of careful consideration, he finally relented. "I shall withdraw my army," he said. "Now, I withdraw now." From this rather pointed episode, a new phrase entered the Western lexicon. To draw a line in the sand, it has come to signify a final boundary, an ultimatum, and for more than 2 millennia, through this simple turn of phrase, Rome has continued to radiate its particular brand of imperious authority. But what if, you ask, Antiochus had been less of a pragmatist? What if he had refused to heed Rome's command? As it happens, someone before him had tried that very thing. This brings us to the cautionary tale of Perseus of Macedon. He too was a man of talent and ambition. Upon ascending the throne, he engaged in a series of minor provocations, which soon earned him a stern warning from Rome. Yet Perseus chose defiance. He chose to stand his ground, even broadcasting his intent to break faith with the Republic entirely. Using this as their pretext, in the year 171 BCE, Rome attacked. The Third Macedonian War had begun. In the early stages, Perseus managed to gain a slight advantage, but in June of 168 BCE, he made a fatal error. He committed his entire force to a single, decisive battle against the Roman legions. He had hoped, in one fell swoop, to shatter Roman power and restore the former glory of the Antigonid dynasty. Alas, the heavens were not aligned with his ambitions. In the ensuing battle, known to history as the Battle of Pydna, Perseus was annihilated. His army was lost, and he himself was captured by the Romans, destined to live out his days as a prisoner in the city of Rome. The kingdom of Macedon was subsequently dismembered by force, carved into 4 separate states, and Perseus, for his troubles, became the last king Macedon would ever know. It was precisely this chilling precedent that so unnerved Antiochus IV, that kept him from daring to step outside that circle drawn in the sand. One can only imagine that if Alexander the Great, in the great beyond, knew that his magnificent inheritance had fallen to such a hapless generation, his disappointment would be profound. Yet even after dismembering Macedon, Rome's anxieties were not assuaged. Finally, in the year 146 BCE, those 4 fledgling states were themselves forcibly dissolved. Rome converted the entire territory into one of its administrative districts. It was named the province of Macedonia. This event, known rather grandly as the Fourth Macedonian War, was, if I may be so bold, nothing of the sort. It was simply the great behemoth of Rome delivering a final, crushing blow to a weakened Macedonia before announcing, "From this day forward, you are all subjects of Rome." Here, we must pause to clarify the concept of a province. The very word province used today for an administrative unit comes directly, without alteration, from the ancient Latin word. It is a direct inheritance. Originally, the Roman term, provincia, referred to the sphere of judicial authority granted to a commander during a time of war. As we have noted, Rome was an empire that prided itself on its adherence to the rule of law. If a general marched his army into foreign territory, could he requisition grain from the locals? The Romans, with increasing frequency, said yes, but it had to be done legally. It required prior authorization from the Senate. This temporary grant of judicial power over a specific territory was the original provincia. In time, the term expanded to encompass all the conquered territories of the Republic. The very first territory to be formally designated a province in this administrative sense was Sicily. In 241 BCE, following the conclusion of the First Punic War, the man who administered such a territory was typically called a governor, or more grandly, a governor-general. A single governor could preside over one or indeed multiple provinces. These terms have survived to this day. Consider, for example, that member of the British Commonwealth, Canada. Its territory is divided into provinces, and its highest authority is a governor-general, appointed by the British monarch, who in theory presides over all 10 provinces and 3 territories of that vast domain. A nominal power, to be sure, but the framework, we must appreciate, was first drafted by the Romans. To return to our narrative, the newly established province of Macedonia was Rome's 6th. At the time, however, it did not include the Greek city-states to the south on the Balkan Peninsula. Rome, it seems, still afforded its former Greek allies a degree of respect, allowing them to maintain a state of semi-independence. In that same fateful year, 146 BCE, another kingdom besides Macedon saw its independence extinguished, transformed into a Roman province. That kingdom was Carthage. Its fate, however, was rather more severe. It was not even permitted to keep its name. The matter unfolded thus. As we have previously discussed, after the Second Punic War, Carthage was reduced to a mere vassal of Rome. Though it still possessed a king and a senate, these were hollow institutions. The Carthaginians could not even decide for themselves with whom they might forge alliances, or against whom they might wage war. It was a humiliating existence. Even so, the Romans remained uneasy. Why? Because the Carthaginians were simply too good at commerce. The Second Punic War had ended in 202 BCE. 50 years later, in 152, a veteran of that war, now a Roman senator named Cato the Elder, paid a visit to Carthage. The old man likely expected a tour of some provincial backwater, a chance to lord it over a population of paupers. Instead, he found himself in a city of such staggering, almost futuristic wealth and decadent prosperity that he was utterly astonished. And so, to prevent this prosperous rival from rising once more, Cato returned to Rome and became the fiercest advocate for renewed warfare against Carthage. At the end of every speech he delivered in the Senate, regardless of the topic, he would add the same refrain: "Furthermore, I believe Carthage must be destroyed." Even if the debate concerned the construction of a new public bathhouse in Rome, he would conclude with that same thundering cry, "Not all in the Senate, however, were of his mind." In particular, a senator named Nasica Corculum, the son-in-law of Scipio Africanus, was his staunchest opponent, so much so that he took to ending all of his own speeches, again, regardless of the topic, with the contrary declaration, "And I believe Carthage must be saved." Now, if you imagine that Corculum's opposition stemmed from some enlightened stance against aggression, some noble defense of human rights and world peace. You would be quite mistaken. His reasoning was one of cold, strategic calculation. If we eliminate Carthage, he argued, the people of Rome, lacking a common enemy, will turn upon themselves and fall into division. Preserving Carthage keeps the Roman people focused and thus more easily controlled. It is a sentiment well understood by strategists throughout the ages. A state without external threats and foreign rivals is a state destined for ruin. For we are born from adversity and we perish in comfort. This disagreement between Cato and Corculum is one for which, even in our own century, there is no easy answer. For 3 years they shouted their refrains at one another to no avail. But in the year 149 BCE, an event occurred that tipped the scales. What was it? Carthage, without notifying Rome, launched an attack on its neighbor, Numidia. The king of Numidia at the time was Massinissa, a man we have met before. He was the key ally and #1 contributor to Scipio Africanus's conquest of Carthage. Now, he was no longer a young man, but an ancient, trembling figure. Seeing the Carthaginian forces advance, he immediately, with quivering hands, dispatched a letter to Rome pleading for aid. When the message arrived, Rome exploded. According to the treaty ending the Second Punic War, Carthage was forbidden from engaging in warfare without Rome's express permission. And what's more, the target of their aggression was Rome's oldest and dearest friend in the region. This was an intolerable affront, and so, throughout the streets and alleys of Rome, Cato's famous phrase began to echo with renewed fervor: Carthage must be destroyed. The Senate, with little further debate, resolved to declare war. We must now ask a critical question. Why did Carthage attack Numidia without first informing Rome? The blame, it seems, lies with Massinissa himself. After Rome's victory, he had grown arrogant, leaning on Roman support to behave with impunity towards Carthage. He seized vast swaths of Carthaginian territory and plundered great wealth. And every time Carthage lodged a complaint with Rome, it fell on deaf ears. Rome, it appeared, was rather indulgent of its old ally. This, naturally, filled the Carthaginians with a bitter and simmering resentment. So why, then, did they wait until 149 BCE to finally act? Because in that year, Carthage at last finished paying off the enormous war indemnity imposed by Rome. In the minds of these tragically misguided people, the final payment signified the automatic termination of the treaty. Carthage, they believed, was free once more from Roman control. They had forgotten a simple, brutal truth. In this world, it is strength that has the final say. And in 149 BCE, the strength of a Rome at the zenith of its power was something Carthage could not hope to match. And so, when they heard that Rome had declared war, their first instinct was to capitulate, to become pliant once more. The Carthaginian Senate instructed its envoys with a single, desperate command: submit to any and all of Rome's conditions. What followed was a masterclass in Roman perfidy. First, they told the Carthaginian delegation that if the 300 most powerful aristocratic families surrendered their children as hostages, Rome would guarantee Carthage's territory and freedom. This condition was met. Then, the Romans added another: surrender all of your armaments, they said, and we shall withdraw our troops. The Carthaginians, seeing little choice, complied, but the Romans, it seemed, had merely been clearing their throats. They claimed to have more to say. We have one further demand, they announced. Surrender all your weapons and your grain, and we will return to Rome, utterly helpless. Staring at the glint of Roman steel, the Carthaginians could only obey. But then came the final, unthinkable demand. You must all, every one of you, evacuate the city of Carthage. You must allow us to raze it to the ground. Only then will our anger be satisfied. Only then will we be content. At this point, even a fool could see the truth. Rome had never intended to allow Carthage to exist. The Carthaginians, their illusions shattered, awoke to a startling and ferocious courage. A profound rage drove them to take up any object that could serve as a weapon. Men and women, young and old, all took to the city walls, vowing to perish with their home. The most extreme expression of this defiance came from the general leading the defense, a man named Hasdrubal. This man, as it happens, was the grandson of the very same Massinissa who had so tormented Carthage. The grandson stood in complete opposition to his grandfather. Filled with a burning hatred for Rome, he had all Roman prisoners within the city dragged to the top of the walls and slowly tortured to death. Their bodies were then hurled from the ramparts. A gruesome testament to his resolve to fight to the last, but do not be too quick to admire him. His final decision will surely leave you speechless. The faithless Romans at first believed they were facing a lone, isolated city. They expected an easy victory, but they soon encountered a power they had not anticipated. The power of pure fury. And how great was this power? For 3 full years, the Roman legions languished before the walls of Carthage, making no progress whatsoever. Finally, in desperation, Rome sent its own famous grandson to the front, Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of the great Scipio Africanus. He took command of the Roman forces. Employing new siege tactics and facing a city now at the absolute limit of its endurance, he finally breached the walls in the year 146 BCE. Carthage had fallen. In the aftermath, the Romans unleashed a massacre of such inhuman brutality that to speak of the sacking of Carthage is no exaggeration at all. It was a bloodbath. When we speak of ancient history, we often hear of cities being sacked after a long siege. This was not merely about the thrill of slaughter. A significant part of it was a calculated performance of terror, a warning to other cities that might consider resisting so stubbornly in the future. Resist and be annihilated. Surrender and life goes on. Does this tactic work? You ask. It is a grim thing to admit, but if it were not effective, it would not have been used so often, as the younger Scipio gave the final order to set the city ablaze. The defending general, that same grandson Hasdrubal, inexplicably chose to surrender himself. This act earned him the contempt of soldiers on both sides, Roman and Carthaginian alike. Even his own wife found his cowardice so shameful that she, taking her children with her, threw herself into the flames. A final sacrifice for her dying city, and so it was, in 146 BCE, that Carthage, following Macedon, was extinguished. It became another Roman province. But the Romans, intent on a complete erasure of memory, gave it a new name, the province of Africa. This was the Latin term for that ancient land, and it is the origin of the name of the continent we know today. At this point, the Roman Republic had conquered the Italian peninsula, the Balkan Peninsula of Greece, the Iberian Peninsula of Spain, and the former Carthaginian lands of North Africa. A vast empire was on the rise, and yet, at the very same time, problems were brewing within Rome itself. What problems? They can be summarized in 2 words. Wealth inequality. Before we delve into this, we must answer 2 other questions. First, who comprised the Roman army? And second, what was the primary source of Rome's wealth during this period? The first question is simple. The army was composed of Roman farmers, or more precisely, farmers who held Roman citizenship. In the beginning, they all owned their own land and lived by cultivating it. But since the founding of the Republic, Rome had been in a near-constant state of war. These farmers were continuously conscripted, and as a result, the fields of Italy were often left fallow. If the land was not being tilled, you might ask, what did everyone eat? This brings us to the answer of the second question. How did the Romans sustain themselves? The answer requires even fewer words, just one, in fact, plunder. In the process of conquering other nations, Rome excelled at 2 things. First, stripping the local wealth and shipping it all back to Rome. Second, enslaving the local populations to produce food, drink, and goods for the Romans. From the province of Sicily alone, the closest to Rome, an annual tribute equivalent to the sustenance for 100,000 people was demanded. With such a system in place, it became increasingly irrelevant whether Roman farmers actually farmed their own land. Indeed, in the year 167 BCE, the sheer volume of plundered and tribute wealth was so immense that Rome announced the abolition of the citizen tax for all Roman citizens. The problem, however, lay in the distribution of this plundered wealth. It was profoundly unequal. The common soldiers and plebeians received almost nothing. Not only did they not share in the spoils, but the newly enriched upper classes, with vast fortunes and little else to do, began to buy up the land of the very soldiers who were away fighting Rome's wars. Fertile lands and estates were acquired at absurdly low prices. When the soldiers returned home, they found their families intact, but their land gone. And all the paperwork was perfectly in order. Their own families had sold it. What could they possibly say? And so, a phenomenon common to nearly all societies occurred in Rome. The consolidation of land into the hands of a few. According to the historical records, we have, by the late Republic, some 320,000 landless Roman citizens. A full third of the city's population were wandering the streets of Rome with nothing to do. But why, you might wonder, would these people become vagrants? Even if the rich bought the land, surely they still needed people to farm it. The reason is brutally simple. Rome's foreign wars brought back not only wealth, but also vast numbers of slaves. If you were a wealthy landowner, would you prefer to hire a group of cheap, disposable slaves whom you could beat, abuse, and even kill at will? Or would you hire a group of former Roman soldiers, citizens with legal rights who could sue you in court? The answer is self-evident. In the year 133 BCE, this growing class of landless Roman proletarians finally found a champion, a tribune of the plebs willing to speak for them. His name was Tiberius Gracchus. Tiberius's lineage was impeccable. Like the younger Scipio, he was a grandson of the great Scipio Africanus. He was also Scipio's brother-in-law, his sister having married the famous general. In short, Tiberius was an aristocrat of the highest order, yet this particular aristocrat was deeply troubled by the state of Rome for two primary reasons. First, he was a product of a classical Greek education, steeped in ideals of liberty and democracy. While slaves might be treated as chattel, the sight of a city teeming with destitute citizens clashed violently with his vision for society. Second, the man had foresight. He believed that this state of affairs would lead to Rome's rapid decline, a collapse in which the aristocracy itself would inevitably be consumed. Upon his election as tribune, Tiberius delivered a powerful speech. He said, "The wild beasts that roam Italy each have their own den, but the men who fight and die for Italy enjoy nothing but the air and the light." This situation must change, and so Tiberius introduced his land reform bill, the Lex Sempronia Agraria. The proposal was straightforward, a redistribution of land. It stipulated that a single family could own a maximum of 250 hectares. Any land held in excess of this amount would be reclaimed by the state and distributed to the landless, with each recipient receiving about 8 hectares, enough to sustain a family. He considered the plan perfect, but to look in the mirror, declare oneself beautiful, and then assume that all others share this opinion and will unanimously crown you Miss World is, to put it mildly, a sign of profound naivety. What Tiberius saw as perfection, the nobles of the Senate saw as rubbish, as radical lunacy, and so our hero's fate was unlikely to be a happy one. Tiberius knew his bill stood no chance of passing in the Senate. He decided, therefore, on a different course. Using his authority as tribune, he planned to bypass the Senate and have the law passed directly by the plebeian council, the assembly of the people. But this plan, too, had a flaw. According to Roman custom, the office of tribune was held by several men simultaneously, each of whom possessed the power to veto the actions of the others. Another tribune, a man named Octavius, had been bought by the Senate. He stood firmly with the aristocrats and vowed to veto the proposal. Faced with this, Tiberius made a fateful move. He delivered a fiery speech to the popular assembly, whipping up the passions of the revolutionary masses, and had Octavius forcibly removed from office. This unfortunate man thus earned a dubious place in history as the first tribune of the plebs to ever be expelled. With the opposition removed, the assembly naturally passed Tiberius's bill. But his actions were illegal. A foundational principle of the tribunate was that its holders were sacrosanct and inviolable. They could not be removed from office before their term expired. Tiberius's move had, in effect, placed the will of the people above the laws of the Republic. This not only gave the Senate a pretext to condemn him, but also deeply unsettled many political moderates. Furthermore, even if the assembly passed the law, it still required the Senate's ratification to become official. And even if it became law, how could it possibly be enforced without the cooperation of the very aristocrats whose land it sought to reclaim? Reform could not simply be willed into revolution. In the end, the land reform achieved nothing, and Tiberius's term as tribune was coming to an end. He knew perfectly well that the moment he stepped down, not only would his reforms be dead, but he himself would face a reckoning. And so, he sought re-election. Fired by his incredible eloquence, a portion of the populace began to fervently support his bid for a second term. On election day, Tiberius arrived at the assembly dressed in mourning clothes. The message was clear. He knew that if he failed to win, he would be prosecuted by the Senate and likely sentenced to death. He had foreseen the ending. But not the process. The nobles in the Senate, fearing that his popular support would grant him another year in office to continue his agitation, decided to act preemptively. Their strategy was simple. They chose violence over debate. On the day of the vote, a large number of thugs hired by the Senate, disguised as ordinary citizens, entered the assembly. They began spreading rumors that Tiberius had ambitions to become king, while simultaneously starting to smash and loot, according to Plutarch's Life of Tiberius. This was a meticulously planned conspiracy. In the ensuing chaos, these men bludgeoned to death over 300 of Tiberius's supporters. Tiberius himself was beaten to death with a wooden bench. It was a scene of utter carnage, but the final indignity was yet to come. The families of the dead were forbidden from collecting the bodies. All were declared traitors to Rome, and their corpses were unceremoniously dumped into the Tiber River. You might ask, was not Tiberius from a great noble family? Did he not have a powerful brother-in-law in Scipio? Why did his own family not support him? The answer is simple. He had alienated them all. His own family did not support his radical course. Even Scipio, it is said, came to despise his firebrand brother-in-law. There were many reasons for this: disagreements on military policy, clashes over foreign affairs, and even, it is rumored, an unhappy marriage between Scipio and Tiberius's sister. But the affairs of ancient Rome are often paradoxical. After Tiberius's death, his land reform law was actually partially implemented. Approximately 80,000 Roman citizens received land, which significantly eased the tensions between the aristocracy and the poor. The reason for this is not complex. Tiberius had indeed represented the will of a very large portion of the populace. The official charge used by the Senate to justify his murder was treason and ambition for kingship, not his reform proposals. So, after his death, to placate public anger, the Senate made concessions, granting land to some of the dispossessed. Of course, this was a limited measure, enough to quell the unrest, but not enough to truly threaten the status quo. The great landowners could spare a little. They too had limits to their resources. It was a masterful political stroke. It gave the common people a tangible benefit, stopping them from further agitation, while making the murder of Tiberius appear legitimate. Many came to genuinely believe that Tiberius was killed not for his reforms, but because he truly sought to be king. The old men of the Roman Senate were not only masters of foreign conquest, their skill at internal political maneuvering was of the highest order. 10 years later, in 123 BCE, a young man named Gaius Gracchus was elected tribune of the plebs. If the name sounds familiar, it is because he was Tiberius's younger brother. Gaius, like his brother, was a staunch advocate for the poor and a firm supporter of land reform. In fact, he went even further. Beyond land, he proposed providing a host of welfare benefits to the common people, which would allow them to accept lower wages from employers. This, he argued, would greatly reduce the number of destitute citizens on the streets. To be honest, I suspect that Gaius genuinely believed his brother had been killed for seeking a crown. Otherwise, it is difficult to explain why he would so brazenly take up his brother's reformist mantle. He might at least have changed a few words, but Gaius had another proposal, one that no one had dared to make before. It concerned the issue of Roman citizenship. At the time, there were two main types of civic status. There was full Roman citizenship, which of course conferred all civic rights and was a source of immense pride. And then there was Latin rights, which was akin to a Roman green card. It granted all the rights of a Roman citizen, except for the right to vote and hold office. As the name implies, this was originally granted to Rome's allies in the Latin League, but in the territories it subsequently conquered, Rome was far less generous. It granted neither Roman citizenship nor Latin rights. What did this mean? Take Carthage, for example. Though it had become the Roman province of Africa, a Carthaginian could not, without permission, conduct business in Rome, marry a Roman, or simply decide to go and live in the great city. Gaius believed this was detrimental to the unity and cohesion of the Roman state. If the Carthaginians thought of themselves as Romans, would that not inspire a greater love for Rome? With this goal in mind, Gaius proposed a radical expansion of enfranchisement. He wanted to grant full Roman citizenship to all Latins, and then progressively extend Latin rights to the peoples of the conquered territories, to render this into a more familiar, if cruder, modern framework. It was as if he proposed to distribute the equivalent of a universal residency permit, a Roman green card, if you will, like so much cheap confetti. Unfortunately, Gaius Gracchus profoundly misjudged the human heart. He had gone too far. It was this very proposal that ultimately cost him all of his support. The very Roman commoners who had lifted him to the office of tribune, upon hearing of this idea, immediately turned against him. Gaius failed to win re-election. And why? Why did the common people oppose his plan to distribute universal rights? The reasons are not complex, and they echo down to our own time. For one, an expansion of a privileged group is most likely to harm the interests of those on the bottom rung, whether in competition for work or for state benefits. For another, there is a psychological component. If the doors to the club are thrown wide open, membership suddenly seems cheap. For a person with little money and no status, that hard-won membership might be the one thing that provides a sliver of superiority over outsiders. To see it given away freely is a personal affront. The Roman plebeians of that era abandoned Gaius for these very same two reasons. Gaius's end was much like his brother's. He died, though in his case, it was a form of suicide. After he lost office, the Senate sent men to arrest him for trial, knowing the charge would be treason and the sentence death. He ordered his personal slave to kill him. The Senate then launched a great purge. According to historical accounts, more than 3,000 of Gaius's supporters were condemned and executed. To say that the Tiber ran red with blood is no overstatement, and so the Gracchi brothers gave their lives for the cause of reform, while their efforts cannot be called a complete failure. As some of their laws and practices did endure, they did not alter one fundamental fact. The relentless consolidation of land continued. The landless poor of Rome still wandered the city streets. This fact would ultimately bear a bitter fruit. What fruit was that? The Roman army, as we have said, had always been composed of landowning citizens. As this class of people rapidly shrank, so too did the pool of available recruits. Moreover, the Romans who still feared losing their land began to develop an aversion to war. "Why should I go to the front and risk my life?" they reasoned, "only to return and find my land has been taken from me." Patriotism is a fine word, but patriotism without a plot of land and a steady meal is a hollow and spectral thing. The bitter fruit, then, was a precipitous decline in the fighting effectiveness of the Roman legions. This was starkly revealed in the Juguthine War, which began in 111 BCE. This was a conflict between Rome and a usurper king of Numidia named Jugurtha. Numidia, as we have noted, was Rome's key African ally in the conquest of Carthage. After the previous king of Numidia died, this Jugurtha killed or drove away all other legitimate heirs and seized the throne for himself. Normally, Rome would not concern itself with such squabbles. So long as the tribute of money and grain arrived on time and regional stability was maintained, who sat on the throne was a matter of indifference. But Jugurtha, for reasons unknown, proceeded to openly murder Roman merchants. This act enraged the Romans, and so, in 111 BCE, the Senate dispatched an army to Numidia. But practice soon proved that the Roman legions of that time were not far from being utterly useless. Against a small tribal confederation like Numidia, the great Roman army fought for 4 full years with no progress at all. Far from killing Jugurtha, they remained tens of thousands of miles from his capital. Skirmishing aimlessly along the North African coast, the Roman commander in Africa at the time was a man named Metellus Numidicus. Under him served a deputy, a lieutenant of considerable military talent who repeatedly offered strategic advice. But Metellus, indignant that a mere subordinate should presume to instruct him, ignored every word. Frustrated, this lieutenant finally took matters into his own hands. He returned to Rome alone. At the annual election for the office of consul, he stirred up the common people and successfully had himself elected. This man's name was Gaius Marius. Upon becoming consul, the first thing Marius did was to carry out a root and branch reform of the Roman army. These are known as the Marian reforms. As we have repeatedly mentioned, the Roman army had always been composed of landowning citizens. Marius abolished this requirement. He decreed that any willing and able-bodied Roman citizen, including the landless proletariat, could enlist, but this immediately created a problem. Roman soldiers of that era were expected to provide their own equipment. How could a penniless vagrant possibly afford such things? Marius, of course, had a solution. From now on, he declared, the state will provide. Every soldier would be equipped with the standard brutal toolkit of the trade, a helmet, a short sword, and a javelin. Not only that, but they would also receive a monthly salary. The catch was that they could no longer serve only during wartime and then return home to their families. Marius stipulated that all legionaries must serve for a term of 16 years. Only then could they retire, but the state would not be ungrateful. Upon retirement, each veteran would be granted a plot of land in one of Rome's newly conquered provinces, enough to provide for their old age, beyond changing the qualifications and service terms for soldiers. Marius, a man who understood the souls of soldiers, completely restructured the legions. A new legion was composed of 10 cohorts. A cohort was subdivided into centuries, and each century, despite its name, consisted of about 80 soldiers led by a centurion. This became the fundamental fighting unit of the new Roman army. This small-scale unit structure had 3 enormous advantages. First, it made command far more flexible. The legion could be easily broken down, dispersed, or reassembled. Second, the men within each unit became intimately familiar with one another, fostering camaraderie and, by extension, combat effectiveness. The final advantage was a stroke of genius. In addition to the eagle standard that all Roman legions carried, Marius decreed that each individual fighting unit should have its own unique banner and emblem. This undoubtedly cultivated a powerful sense of collective spirit and honor. In the later empire, losing one's standard was a crime so severe it could be punished by decimation. What is decimation? It was a rule designed for mass punishment when individual culprits could not be identified. The men were divided into groups of 10, and lots were drawn. The unlucky man who drew the short straw was executed by his 9 comrades. In other words, 10% of the army bore the punishment for the collective crime, while the other 90% were pardoned. As brutal as it sounds, it presented a grim choice for a mutinous legion: face certain death as outlaws, or take a 1 in 10 chance of execution with a 90% chance of a full pardon. A reform of such magnitude, born of necessity, rarely comes without a cost. A professional soldier, paid and equipped not by the state in abstract, but by the general in person, tends to develop a rather specific sense of allegiance. His loyalty is not to the Senate, nor to the idea of Rome, but to the man who fills his purse and promises him land. I must regretfully inform you that this is precisely what transpired. Marius's reforms undoubtedly enhanced the army's combat power, but they also set the Republic's military on a rapid course towards privatization, and this ultimately led to an event unprecedented in the history of the Roman Republic. What event was that? We shall hold that thought for a moment, as we will come to it very shortly, to return to our main thread, when Marius, with his newly reformed legions, returned to the African theater. The outcome was swift and decisive. In 105 BCE, he utterly defeated Numidia. His subordinate, a man named Sulla, even captured Jugurtha himself. The war was finally over. Victorious, Marius and Sulla became the heroes of the Republic. They then led their armies north to defeat barbarian tribes, securing Rome's frontiers, and also put down rebellions among some of Rome's allies. And so, the stature of these two men grew ever greater. In the year 88 BCE, Sulla was himself elected consul. By tradition, the consuls led the army in times of war, and it just so happened that a kingdom in the east named Pontus, in league with several Greek city-states, was preparing to revolt against Rome. Upon hearing this news, Sulla was elated. This was a golden opportunity. The Greek city-states were weak. The time was ripe to accumulate military glory and enhance his reputation, but Sulla had not counted on his old commander. Marius, who was at that time sitting at home, bored, and also looking for a chance to win new accolades, Marius exerted his considerable influence in the Senate. And when the name of the commander for the Eastern expedition was announced, it was not Sulla, it was Marius. At this, Sulla was enraged, in a fit of fury. He raced south to the loyal legions he had personally trained. He raised his arms and called for them to cleanse the court, to march on Rome and destroy that villain. Marius, to the astonishment of everyone, the Roman legions did just that. They followed Sulla north, toward the city of Rome, prepared to do battle with their own countrymen. This was the unprecedented event I alluded to earlier. For the first time in its history, a Roman army marched on Rome itself. In that moment, Sulla became something new in Roman history, a dark prefiguration of what was to come. He was the Republic's first great warlord, and Rome itself was now just another city to be conquered. The poor senators of Rome had not only never seen such a thing, they had never even heard of such a thing. Marius, panicked, turned and fled. The other senators, being older and less agile, had no choice but to negotiate with Sulla. "Nephew," they pleaded, "what is it you truly want?" "I wish to lead the army against Pontus," Sulla replied. The senators breathed a collective sigh of relief. Was that all? Was it really worth all this fuss? And so, very quickly, a new notice was posted outside the Senate House. The commander of the Eastern expedition was now our comrade, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. But no sooner had Sulla departed with his army than Marius crept back into the city. Inspired by Sulla's example, he had brought his own troops this time. And so the old men of the Senate had no choice but to bow to Marius's intimidation and elect him consul for the following year. Once in office, Marius, along with his co-consul Cinna, posted their own notice outside the Senate. It also bore Sulla's name. Only this time, it declared Sulla a traitor, a public enemy of Rome, and sentenced him to exile. Why not death? Because Sulla was at that very moment leading Rome's finest legions in a war against Pontus. Marius had no way of actually arresting and executing him. The sentence of exile was merely to save face. When Sulla's army, fighting in the east, heard of the events back home, his officers suggested he turn back immediately and deal with the old rogue, Marius. But Sulla rejected this advice. "Let us first defeat Pontus," he said, "and then we shall return to crush the rebels." So, in this clash of titans between Marius and Sulla, who would have the last laugh? And where was the great Roman Republic, now reliant on a professional army, headed while Sulla was away on his eastern campaign? Marius retook control of Rome. Sulla, however, remained unconcerned, ordering his men to first crush the rebellion in Pontus and only then settle accounts with Marius. He could afford to be so confident for a single reason. Rome's elite legions were all under his personal command. In 83 BCE, having forced Pontus into submission, Sulla led his army of 40,000 men back to Rome, prepared to liquidate his political enemies. But when he arrived, he found he was punching at air. His rival, Marius, had died of natural causes 3 years earlier, and before Sulla had even set foot in Italy, the other consul, Cinna, had been killed by his own mutinous soldiers. With both of his main adversaries dead, Sulla unleashed his pent-up fury on Marius's supporters. He began the infamous proscriptions. The decree, in essence, gave Sulla the power to declare anyone a public enemy of Rome. Once you were on the list, you could be killed or plundered by anyone with impunity. Sulla even declared openly before the Roman assembly, "To my enemies, I will show no mercy. I will employ the cruelest of means." And so began a great purge. Many histories describe this period as one of extraordinary cruelty. But I believe this may be open to question. My reasoning rests on a single piece of evidence. There was one man who, against all odds, did not lose his head in this purge. And this man's connections were rather compromising. His uncle by marriage was none other than Marius. His father-in-law was Cinna, Sulla's other mortal enemy. If the purge was truly as relentless as claimed, a man with such a background should have had no chance of survival. His head should have, with a dull thud, fallen to the ground, and yet, according to the histories, Sulla even offered this man a way out. "Divorce your wife," he said, "and I will not kill you." But the young man stiffened his neck. "Kill me if you must," he retorted, "but to ask me to divorce my wife and become a bachelor is impossible." That such a defiant young man survived this supposedly merciless slaughter should indeed make us question just how cruel Sulla truly was. Hearing this, some might say, to risk death for the sake of one's marriage, this man must have been a paragon of romantic devotion, true to his love until the seas run dry. His wife must have been exceptionally fortunate. If you believe that, the truth may disappoint you, for this man was, in fact, every woman's lover. His nickname was the Bald Adulterer. He was said to have had affairs with the wives of over 200 Roman senators. The rumor spread like wildfire until the legionaries, with their usual crude wit, had coined a jeering nickname for him: every woman's man and every man's woman. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar was born in the year 100 BCE to aristocratic families on both sides. As we've mentioned, his aunt married Marius, and he himself married the daughter of Cinna. If the political situation in Rome had remained stable, he might have lived out his days as a profligate rich heir. But now, he stood defiantly before Sulla, awaiting judgment. As it happened, the young Caesar must have been quite well liked. After many nobles interceded on his behalf, Sulla finally relented. He spared Caesar's life, but exiled him from Rome, sending him to the frontiers. Many histories record Sulla saying to those around him, "In this boy Caesar, there are 100 Mariuses." Of course, one should take such records with a grain of salt. If Sulla had truly known how formidable Caesar would become, he would have had him eliminated without a second thought. And if Caesar had not become so formidable, Sulla would never have said such a thing. It is the same logic as auspicious omens. Historians who do not occasionally pepper their narratives with such legendary tales will find their books do not sell. After purging his enemies, Sulla, to prevent any future reprisals against himself, took a final, decisive step. He compelled the Roman Senate to pass a resolution appointing him dictator for life. The office of dictator, as we have discussed, was the supreme position in the Roman system, granting the power of life and death. But its term was deliberately short. Only 6 months. For 6 months you were a king, but after that, you were a common citizen again, and not at all immune to being called to account. But now Sulla said, "The rules can be changed. Let's change 6 months to, say, 10,000 years." And so, Sulla became the first lifelong dictator in the history of the Roman Republic. The tribunes, the popular assemblies, the Senate itself, all the institutions designed to check the power of the consuls, became his subordinates. But man proposes, and heaven disposes. In 79 BCE, due to failing health, Sulla announced his retirement and went into seclusion. The following year, his death was officially announced. Rome gave him a grand state funeral. The Romans, like the Greeks, had a custom of writing their own epitaphs. Sulla left behind a line that, while seemingly plain, was in fact supremely imperious. The translation is this: "No friend ever served me, and no enemy ever wronged me, whom I have not repaid in full." After Sulla's death, 2 men rapidly rose to prominence in the Roman political scene, one named Pompey, the other Crassus. Some books claim they were both Sulla's trusted lieutenants. This is difficult to say for certain. It is true that Crassus used Sulla's prescriptions to amass a colossal fortune. He was not only the richest man in Rome, a corrupt official and businessman, but likely one of the 10 wealthiest individuals in all of world history. One of his methods of enrichment will tell you all you need to know about the blackness of his heart. Crassus organized a private fire brigade in Rome. Whenever a building caught fire, he and his brigade would appear. On the spot, he would demand the owner sign over the property to him at a pittance. If they refused, he would simply let the building burn to the ground. And in Rome, where buildings were made of wood, fires were not only common, but spread with terrifying speed. Using this method, he acquired countless properties, which he then rented out for immense profit. Historians have a very precise assessment of Crassus. He was neither a loyal friend nor an implacable enemy. When his own interests were at stake, he could shed personal attachments and animosities without a moment's hesitation. In modern parlance, his allegiance was to whomever was providing the milk. In the face of money, things like affection and hatred were utterly meaningless. He could be kneeling to lick your boots 1 second and selling you out for a pittance the next. So, to say he grew rich by clinging to Sulla is correct. To say he was Sulla's confidant is baseless. As for Pompey, he too was a man who pursued his own interests without scruple. But unlike Crassus, his desire was not for money, but for military glory. I personally believe Pompey's ambition was to become a man like Alexander the Great, not in status, but in the sheer scale of his military conquests and achievements. As a young man, in pursuit of this goal, he cast aside his first wife to marry Sulla's stepdaughter, thereby gaining the right to command armies and become a general of the Republic. From that point on, he was almost constantly away from Rome, leading troops. If, in the Rome that followed Sulla's death, Crassus was the wealthiest man, then Pompey was the one with the most military might. And what brought these 2 men together in Rome? to ultimately suppress the Senate and seize the highest powers of the state, was a slave revolt. In 73 BCE, 6 years after Sulla's death, a famous slave uprising erupted on the Italian peninsula, known to posterity as the Spartacus Revolt. No matter how much we may praise the democracy of Greece or the rule of law in Rome today, we cannot escape one fact: both were slave societies. Their prosperity was built upon the blood and sweat of countless slaves. Rome, even more so than Greece, plundered vast numbers of slaves from its foreign conquests. These slaves generally had 3 destinations. One was to serve as domestic servants in the households of wealthy nobles. This was the best possible fate. The second was to toil on farms, in mines, or in workshops. This was the destiny of the vast majority. And the third was to become a gladiator, as we have noted. The Roman people had 3 great pastimes: watching gladiators, waging war, and taking baths. When not at war, besides lounging and chatting in the great public baths. The ancient Romans had the rather gruesome hobby of gladiatorial combat. They adored watching men fight to the death against other men, or against wild beasts. The noble lords and ladies would dress in their finest attire, sit high up in the stands, and watch the life and death struggles below. These contests usually ended in death and were, as you can imagine, exceedingly bloody. The Romans, it seems, had a taste for violent aesthetics. Of course, the slaves of that time had no desire to see their names appear in the annals of such contests. They were engaged in what was arguably the most dangerous profession in all of human history. And so, in 73 BCE, some 70 gladiators, led by a slave named Spartacus, escaped from their training school in Capua in southern Italy and launched a rebellion. As slaves and impoverished peasants from across the land flocked to their banner, the rebel army quickly swelled to some 120,000 men. It was a formidable force, but this army had a fatal flaw. It had no clear objective. Historians have long debated what these slaves actually wanted to achieve. Some say they wished to cross the Alps and live freely among the barbarian tribes to the north. Others claim they wanted to conquer Rome and become its new masters. Still others suggest they hoped to establish an independent kingdom in the south. But in the end, many historians have reluctantly concluded that Spartacus and his followers were likely just a swarm of hornets without a nest. They had no plan. A revolution requires a program. If the goal is not even clear, a program is out of the question. And so, this army of slaves simply rampaged across the countryside, looting and killing, living one day at a time. Although they caused a massive commotion, forcing the Roman Senate to move from initial nonchalance to a state of high alert. A disorganized mob is still a disorganized mob. When Crassus was commissioned by the Senate to lead 8 legions to crush the rebellion, the fate of Spartacus and his men was sealed. In 71 BCE, Spartacus's army was cornered by Crassus in Calabria. With their backs to the sea, the slave rebels launched a final, desperate charge against the legions. They were defeated, their army annihilated. Spartacus himself died on the battlefield, though his body was never found. Now, the Roman Senate had actually arranged for double insurance in this war. In addition to Crassus's 8 legions, they had also recalled Pompey from his campaigns in Spain, but Pompey arrived a little late. Crassus had already won the decisive battle by the time he landed in southern Italy. As we have said, Pompey valued military glory above all else. He therefore ordered his men to hunt down the scattered remnants of the rebel army. He rounded up over 5,000 of them, had them all crucified along the Appian Way, and then marched towards Rome, proclaiming himself the chief hero who had put down the Spartacus rebellion. Crassus, ever the merchant, did a quick calculation and realized he could not win a direct confrontation with Pompey. He immediately signaled his willingness to cooperate. Pompey, knowing full well he was merely stealing the credit, could not be too brazen, and so the 2 men, hand in hand, led their armies back to the city of Rome. The nobles of the Senate, seeing the dust clouds of countless soldiers approaching the city with Pompey and Crassus at their head, decided they could not afford to offend either man. They awarded both of them a triumphal procession. Subsequently, Pompey and Crassus jointly ascended to the position of consul, becoming, in effect, the joint heirs to Sulla's legacy. The Roman Republic, which had begun with an electoral system, a true republic, had now fully degenerated into a state of military rule. Whoever had the soldiers was the boss. But Pompey sought fame, and Crassus sought money. Their political skills and ambitions were far inferior to Sulla's. Having reached the consulship, they were content. They busied themselves with their own affairs and did not seek the office of dictator, nor did they harbor designs of ruling Rome alone. The old foxes in the Senate, meanwhile, used various means to sideline them, and so the two men served a few unremarkable terms as consuls, achieving little. After they stepped down, their influence began to wane. Pompey, for instance, repeatedly tried and failed to get the Senate to pass more favorable settlement policies for the veterans who had fought with him. They wouldn't refuse him outright, but they would endlessly stall and prevaricate. Crassus, having made his fortune, now longed to campaign in the east against the rising Parthian Empire to earn some military prestige. The Senate, again, would drag its feet, finding all manner of excuses to put him off, leaving him deeply frustrated. You might be asking, wasn't Rome's eastern neighbor the Seleucid Empire? The remnant of Alexander's conquests. When did this Parthia appear? This was a gradual process. The Seleucid dynasty, after the death of Antiochus IV, went into a steady decline. It was constantly being chipped away by Rome in the west and pressured by the new, rising power of Parthia in the east. The Parthians, an Iranian people like the Persians, had quietly developed in a corner southeast of the Black Sea. After Alexander destroyed the Persian Empire, they began to expand, absorbing surrounding tribes and eventually forming a great empire of their own. They then turned their attention to the ailing Seleucids, the poor Seleucids. Caught between these two great powers, were finally doomed. In 64 BCE, Pompey extinguished their last remnant, and they vanished from the stage of history. After this, Rome shared a direct border with the ascendant Parthian Empire. It was this new master of Central Asia that Crassus, green with envy at Pompey's military record, so desperately wanted to attack. And so, though Pompey and Crassus both had their ambitions, they lacked the political cunning to outmaneuver the old foxes of the Senate. It was at this moment, in the year 60 BCE, that a certain man approached them both, seeking an alliance. "If you give me your full support," he said, "I guarantee that you, Pompey, will see your veterans properly settled with land and property, and you, Crassus, will be given your command in the east to make war on Parthia." The man who said this was none other than the aforementioned Julius Caesar. We last saw Caesar being exiled from Rome during Sulla's reign, but as the saying goes, true gold will glitter wherever it is. Caesar's first stop was Bithynia, a Roman client kingdom in modern-day northwestern Turkey. It was not long before he became inseparable from the king of Bithynia. So much so that many began to whisper that the handsome 18-year-old Caesar had surely used his charms to bewitch the king. That is to say, they were lovers. The rumor spread like wildfire until the legionaries, with their usual crude wit, had coined a jeering nickname for him: every woman's man and every man's woman. Whether Caesar's tastes were truly so eclectic is not recorded in the histories, and I do not know, but his enthusiasm for the female sex was as warm and certain as the spring. After Sulla's death, Caesar returned to Rome and successively held the offices of Quaestor, Pontifex Maximus, Praetor, and others, while busily serving the people of Rome. He was also, with even greater passion, offering his most sincere services to the women of the city. Many histories record that he had illicit relationships with the wives of a full third of the Senate. including, it is said, the wives of both Pompey and Crassus. If this is true, then to call him a walking hormone, a super predator of the seas of love, would be a most objective assessment. The main reason for Caesar's meteoric rise in politics and his simultaneous success with women was his immense generosity. The man never cared for money. Even when he was deeply in debt himself, he never hesitated to reward his subordinates, nor was he ever stingy in buying the ancient equivalent of luxury handbags for his favored mistresses. The most curious part is that his largest creditor was Crassus himself. The great financier was lending Caesar money, which Caesar then spent on Crassus's own wife. Whether the great tycoon was simply magnanimous or possessed a peculiar form of cunning, we do not know. Among Caesar's many mistresses, his favorite was a woman named Servilia. Though she was older than him, they maintained a relationship for over 20 years. When Servilia grew old, she even introduced her own daughter to Caesar, who also became his lover. But as they say, fate has a strange sense of irony. Years later, Caesar would die at the hands of Servilia's son, but that is a story for later. In 60 BCE, the 40-year-old Caesar prepared to run for the office of consul, though the position was elected annually, and nearly every noble Roman family could boast a consul or two in its history. It was still the highest office in the Republic, a fiercely contested prize. So, to be safe, Caesar approached Pompey and Crassus and made them the aforementioned promises. So the question is this: would Pompey and Crassus, these two men who had allegedly been so cuckolded, support their rival in love, Caesar?